or good evening, depending on where you're calling in from. My name is Aaron Stein, Professor, Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And today we are joined by Michael Kaufman, who's the Director of the Russia team at the Center for Naval Analysis, and Rob Lee, who is a Senior Fellow here at FPRI. And we're going to get a general sense of how the Russian invasion of Ukraine is coming along now that we're a couple of months into this. The way that this is going to work is that Rob and Mike are going to give some introductory thoughts for about 5 to 8 minutes each, and then we'll have some moderated question and answers before we begin to integrate attendee questions. At this point, I believe everybody probably knows how to use Zoom, but for the unlikely event that this is your first time, if you look at the bottom, you'll see a question and answer, Q&A. If you just click on that and type your questions, I'll do my best to moderate and pose these questions to our two panelists. So with that, Rob, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can go ahead and kick us off.
Great. So I usually initially kind of start with my views of what's happening, kind of what I see going forward. So my views haven't changed that much the last, I don't know, like 3 or 4 weeks. Basically, the Battle of Donbass has been going on for 3 to 4 weeks now, maybe a little longer. Russia's had some gains. They're making some incremental gains today. It still isn't clear, that they can actually have, significant success. Not clear they're going to be able to do any kind of real breakthrough that's going to be rapid, or be able, significantly cut off Ukrainian forces. If they can't achieve that, at least in my view, I don't think Russia can really achieve any kind of strategic gains there. And the big question was always basically numbers. Did Russia have enough numbers and to have a numerical advantage, at the strategic level, operational level, or even tactical level, it's sufficient to actually have success in these kind of offensive in the Donbass area. And, I think that in some cases they are at tactical level having that kind of superiority, but not enough to really be that significant. And that's why so far we're seeing relatively slow advances. It seems to be quite costly. Some, photos yesterday of this crossing one of the rivers that seem to take really heavy attrition, which has been a kind of general point of just in general, they've had difficulties crossing rivers and taking losses. And it seems to be that's going to be the case in the future. And basically, because Russia, when they invaded with 75–80% of their battalion groups of their kind of permanent readiness forces, the ground force units, and with that they deployed with conscripts, they deployed with Rosguardia units. They really didn't have much of a reserve if they ran into trouble, right? And we saw them beginning, we knew them beginning, and of course they did. And so even though they rebalanced the Donbass, Ukrainians rebalanced the Donbass too. And it's not clear they're going to have that much success beyond kind of limited kind of gains by taking certain towns to certain cities. So the big question right now, and I know Michael's going to get into it in a minute, is basically Russia has three options. They can either escalate, they can continue the war as it is, or they can de-escalate. The current path they're proceeding with doesn't appear that they're going to have much success doing, continue this path. Maybe they'll take more territory in Donbass. It doesn't look like they're going to be able to take that much more beyond this unless they make some kind of changes. If they escalate, right, the most likely option is mobilization. There are different kind of mobilizations options they have, but there's huge risks that come with that. And it's not clear that mobilizing conscripts or reservists will be necessarily militarily that effective. And then if you try and de-escalate, there's no reason to believe Ukraine would be willing to kind of end the war, to let Russia kind of de-escalate on their terms. They have every kind of incentive to continue this war and try and retake kind of territory that Russia currently holds. So all three options, there are risks associated with them. Not clear that any of them are a kind of clear exit strategy for Russia from this war. The problem is we look about sustaining this war. Even if Russia just wants to sustain holding the territories they have in Kherson and Kharkiv elsewhere, they're probably going to need to consider some kind of mobilization, limited mobilization in the coming months, because right now their permanent readiness units have been committed to this war. They've been there for two and a half months. They've taken heavy casualties. They're going to become exhausted. Russia does not have enough permanent readiness units to do a sustainable rotation. So that's going to become an issue coming in a few weeks. Is Russia's going to make a decision about whether or not they mobilize in some regard or in some way change the current trajectory of this conflict, because it doesn't appear that it's sustainable for Russia. It's probably more sustainable for Ukraine.
Well, thanks, Rob. Mike, why don't you just pick up from there?
Sure. So first, let me pick up on the force structure issues, which I've been highlighting for a while now. From my point of view, are in some ways very deterministic. Often wars beyond the initial operation, they're very difficult to predict, but they come down to manpower and material more often than not. And Russia has huge issues here, as Rob highlighted. So the force as it is was really not designed and not structured to conduct a large-scale military operation of this type without raising the manning levels. The Russian military is a tiered readiness force by design, and there were conscious choices and trade-offs made within that. And I think we'll talk a bit later here, that force in practice in terms of readiness ended up being a lot smaller than we even thought going into this war, with real discrete choices in there that made the Russian plan such that it maximized Russian weaknesses rather than actually dealing with the choices within that military. So looking out forward, while general mobilization I always thought was a mistaken focus in the conversation, because it's neither likely nor is the Russian military set up for any kind of mass mobilization. It's not the Soviet army. That's one of the big differences with it. But behind the scenes, there is piecemeal, let's say, shadow mobilization that has been taking place. What's clearly happening is Russian leadership is taking these partial efforts to kick the can down the road and actually making the situation in many cases worse for themselves, because right now they're trying to raise manning levels by first offering lucrative contracts for short-term service down to 4 months at a fairly sizable payout to anyone willing to serve. Probably pushing conscripts to convert into contract servicemen so that they can be deployed, and likely hunting for new contract servicemen amongst those who are reservists, or let's say in the BAR's reserve system as well. All these efforts are going to simply extend the problems they're currently facing. At the end of the day, their biggest issue right now is the political framing of this war. So because this war is a special operation, even though Russia is not a country where there's rule of law, it is an incredibly procedural state. And framed as a special operation, there are certain important considerations. First, Russia cannot deploy conscripts into this war. Although it's clear some units cheated early on, but there's over 250,000 conscripts in the Russian military, and they're not considered to be deployable for this kind of conflict because it's not a declared war. Second, Russian contract servicemen actually can refuse to serve and try to tear up their contracts because Russia is not in a state of war. And third, the state doesn't really have the ability to declare any kind of mobilization, because to do mobilization on a larger scale, you would need to actually declare some kind of state of war, or you need to change laws and procedures. And they haven't done any of these things, right? So I'm not saying that the Russian political leadership needs to declare a state of war. That's the fastest and probably most unpalatable or riskiest solution for them. But then they need to implement big changes, and they're not doing some of these things either. On the operational side, but I'd like to add to Rob's comments, it's kind of clear that early on, the Russian military was starting out with something like a double envelopment, trying to push forces towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and at least partially envelop them from the west, and at the same time focus on the Severodonetsk salient east of them, and essentially try to cut up those two sections of the Ukrainian defensive line. That effort failed. It's pretty clear the Russian military doesn't have the forces, and for all sorts of reasons that we can potentially discuss, they weren't successful in making major gains in the first several weeks of this offensive. I suspect that's why Gerasimov showed up in Izum, to personally change the direction of this operation. And it's clear that the Russian military has shifted the weight of the effort towards Severodonetsk and has largely abandoned the pursuit of any advances from Izum. And that's, I think, part of the reason why we've seen these attempts to make river crossings along the, across the Seversky Donetsk River, is because they're trying to essentially now focus on enveloping Ukrainian forces at Severodonetsk by capturing Popasna, which is south of it, and also trying to push from the north to sever Ukrainian lines. At least that seems to be what their operational plan is. Obviously, they're meeting a lot of resistance, and I think to some extent there's a debate. What are the real challenges behind the Russian effort now? Force availability is very clearly one of them. A lot of the force has been attrition. Having BTG counts now, to me, is, to be perfectly honest, kind of useless, because we don't really know what end strength we're talking about. We're really looking at fragments of units, and the BTG numbers don't really tell you about the kind of force capability or density you're looking at on the battlefield. It's not clear what the situation is with morale. It's quite possible Russian forces are not keen to prosecute the fight, or maybe not advancing because of morale issues. And on the logistical side, there, I think the story is probably better for them in terms of resourcing of the effort, and they have far fewer forces to support in this fight. They don't seem to be having ammunition issues, but that merits exploring. Anyway, I'll close out on that, and maybe turn it over back to you to get the conversation going.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. I wanted to come back to both of you to talk about this manpower issue. There was speculation, Mike, you referred to it, is that Putin would use the May 9th Victory Day speech to call for mass mobilization. Now, I know, Mike, you were always skeptical of that, and obviously that didn't come to fruition. But I think everybody wants to know is, with these manpower shortages that you both have talked about, is when will this force be exhausted? Are they already exhausted? And, if so, are they well set up for a war of attrition from where they're at now? I guess maybe I'll come to Rob and then I'll come to you, Mike.
Sure. So, one thing Mike kind of alluded to, we're working an article about the personnel issues in the Russian military, and it was known that personnel was a problem, right? It was a weakness of the Russian military compared to other militaries. They didn't have an NCO corps. It was always a question about how many contract servicemen they had, and other issues about that. But it's become even clearer based on some of these kind of captured documents about the extent of the issues for personnel. And the personnel issues, in particular, there's a lack of infantry in the Russian military. And so when they kind of dole out contract servicemen, right, the priorities for those jobs are highly technical skills, and then NCO billets, and then kind of elite units, right? So because the ground forces have the fewest really highly technical skills, that a service with the most conscripts, right? So the Navy, everyone on a submarine is supposed to be a contract serviceman, and other kind of technical roles like air defense and that nature. It takes more time to train, so a conscript can't do it. Well, a basic infantryman, you can kind of get away with doing less training, assuming they might be useful, or other jobs like being a driver, like a truck driver. And so the problem is, a lot of these Russian ground force units, like logistics units, they couldn't find enough drivers who are contract servicemen. So they rely on conscripts or rely on civilians in peacetime. And then, lo and behold, when war happens, and you can't deploy those conscripts, you can't deploy civilians, they had a significant lackage of contract drivers, right? Basic, guys who are serving were basically privates who were driving trucks. They didn't have enough of them, so they couldn't man all these logistics kind of convoys. Same thing in infantry units. They didn't have enough guys to be, we focus on NCOs being the issue in the Russian military. In reality, they have enough NCOs. The problem is they don't have enough infantry contract privates. And so because of that, right, the units are smaller than we expected. And basically, it looks as though they reduced the table organization for Russian motorized rifle units and other units to kind of deal with these personnel shortages. And as they're increasing the BTG count, right, they reduce the size of these units, both in terms of TO, and even when they reduce TO, from maybe to like a 340, 360 kind of man battalions, they weren't even manning that, right? They're only manning to have those battalions 2/3 manned, 3/4 manned that they actually deployed to Ukraine. And then the BTGs, right, when they actually formed it, we're seeing BTGs that are like 450 guys, 600 guys. So far smaller than what we thought they're going to be. And the variance is massive. So some BTGs are 450, some are 900, right? And so basically it's how do you count these kind of things? It was pretty clear for a while that, counting a BTG as one kind of unit when there's such a huge variation in size, it makes no sense. And in reality, a lot of these kind of Russian battalions are, more similar to, say, American reinforced company as opposed to battalion. So the problem is those personnel issues affect everything, right? They have a massive effect on logistics. Maintenance was a problem. They didn't have enough guys to maintain vehicles. They don't have enough dismounts to fight in urban terrain, right? All these other kind of issues. and it's a cascading effect across the Russian military that it hurts every kind of aspect about their campaign. And so now we're talking about, how well can they sustain this war? Well, we know they've taken heavy attrition. The attrition was predominantly in these kind of elite units or units that had riflemen, right, or motorized rifle units. That means the share of the fighting now has increased as more kind of DNR, LNR militias are a bigger share of the Russian force than these regular Russian, motorized rifle units. And ultimately, a lot of these units are already attrited, and so they deployed to Ukraine already at reduced strength, and then whatever casualties it took makes it much worse. And in reality, they had somewhat ad hoc units. They were forming kind of squads the day of this war because they weren't told ahead of time. And now, they're probably doing some of that again. And when you amalgamate units, right, they don't have time to train together, they're not cohesive units, they're much less effective. So all these kind of things are kind of like known issues about how you want to fight or you don't want to fight, how you kind of form units. And the way kind of Russia went about this war by not telling a lot of these units ahead of time. And they already had these manning issues, right before the war started. They didn't have time to fix these issues or kind of think about how to fix these issues. So all that basically it explains a lot of what the problems Russia had in the beginning of this war. And then now why it's so difficult to kind of adapt and overcome, just because they don't have the units. They never had the units to have a sustainable rotation if things went wrong. And units they did deploy already had issues right when they deployed in the beginning. So all those kind of things really affect what Russia can do. And it comes back to just saying, you can only adapt so much when you start a war in such kind of bad terms. And it's remarkable, again, that at the high level, Russia was playing this war since, at least July. And they're already put pieces in place last March, a year ago or so. It's remarkable that at the high level, at Putin's level or other senior military level, they were playing this war, and that none of this stuff was kind of pushed down to get lower guys. So they didn't have time to kind of think through some of these issues, how to mitigate these kind of weaknesses, these readiness problems, except, until like the day prior to the war. And so all that kind of stuff comes back, and it's just remarkable the way they kind of went into this war and how basically or just senior leadership set the military up for failure, knowing they had weaknesses and they didn't try to address them.
Mike?
Yeah, let me add to that. So, and I'll a little bit also, I think, re-summarize. So I would like to say, show me your force structure and I'll tell you who you are. Military's left to right, all these brilliant operations concepts, but force structure is very revealing and it has strategic effects on a conflict, because when it comes down to who built the most hedge, what can the force do when things go wrong, what can the force actually do when the political leadership makes them fight a war they didn't necessarily plan or train for, so on and so forth. Force structure is going to have some pretty deterministic effects, right? So as Rob was saying, the big choice on tiered readiness, but also cutting infantry in maneuver formations had a huge effect. The force on the whole had much lower readiness than I think we thought before the war. Definitely parts of the Russian system at least looked like they didn't know about this. So to some extent, when folks say, hey, Russian military, how come you didn't know the extent of the rot? I don't think the Russian military actually knew about some of the extent of the rot. And not telling much of the military ahead of time that they were sending them to a war meant that the various people who on the margins were potentially cheating or misreporting couldn't fix this problem and couldn't adapt and couldn't reorganize in advance of a conflict, because they didn't actually know that that's what the military was going to do. And a lot of things that I've seen kind of written in the last 2 months on the challenge of the Russian military, well, I want to be honest that they're putting the emphasis on the wrong place. It's not so much the lack of NCOs, and it's less an ability to do combined arms. How do you do combined arms if you don't have any infantry? Like, you have no dismount infantry to support tanks, and tanks are operating without support, infantry is operating without armor in some cases, so on and so forth. That said, I want to qualify this by saying this picture is seen a problem across the board, but also quite uneven depending on what military district you look at. And different military districts came in with somewhat different force structure, and they seem to all have the problem, but it was to varying extents, sort of the gravity of it. So to answer your question, Aaron, what does it tell us about the situation? Well, I will kind of repeat, or at least some predictions I've made in recent weeks. At first, this is Russia's last offensive operation in this war, because if you look at the attrition they've suffered and what the force is going to allow them to do, independent of whether or not they make gains on the ground, or this ends up being a costly drawn operation, or they suffer a defeat, I just don't think that they have any further offensive potential under these conditions. Second, this war is not sustainable for Russia as a war of attrition, especially not with Ukraine's level of mobilization and access to Western conventional weapons and ammunition and logistics, okay? Third, I want to balance that last statement, which is Russia does have options to extend staying power without any sort of general mobilization. That's why I always thought that was the wrong conversation to have. They can definitely extend their staying power in this conflict. It won't necessarily change their fortunes in this war, but they could do things to be able to rotate troops, to be able to bring additional personnel, and to have much greater staying power overall, especially if they're going to try to hold on territory they currently occupy, right? And where that takes us down the line, we can debate, but I also want to put that out there as well. So I don't want to make it sound like, well, the Russian military has maybe no more further offensive potential. It's important to recognize that there's a good chance the Russian military isn't just going to melt away quickly either, right? And much of it depends on the political choices they're going to make and what point they make them. But if they do drag it out and essentially procrastinate, Russian political leadership are the masters of halfway measures and waiting to make key decisions, and that's clearly what they're doing now. This is actually their MO. Then they're going to make the whole situation worse. And what is a strategic defeat could become a much more self-evident and even rapid and cataclysmic defeat for Russia, I think. So of course, everything in conflict is contingent, but that's my sense of where it could go.
The other thing that I want to ask both of you is the level of Western support for the Ukrainians themselves, and we've seen a considerable increase throughout this conflict, I think sort of culminating in the recent Lend-Lease provisions coming out of the US, I think to the tune of $20 billion worth of military aid, 33 billion overall, right? Can you talk a little bit about the effect of this Western support, for the Ukrainians themselves, and how that could help them, I guess, maybe continue the fight or to withstand this last Russian offensive, this last Russian offensive. So maybe Rob or Mike, if you guys want to take this, whoever wants to go first, it's up to you guys.
Sure. So if you look over the course of war about the importance of NATO kind of weaponry, it's grown since the beginning. Right in the beginning, Ukraine was fighting mostly with their own equipment, and they're having a lot of success with that. As the conflict's gone on, a lot of their stuff they obviously lost a lot of equipment. They've run out of ammunition for some of the equipment. So it's become, maybe not as decisive, but it's become very, very important in terms of Ukraine's ability to stay in this war. They're relying on NATO support. And it is being, I think from, the way you're hearing comments from Russian officials, they realize that's basically the decisive, one of the decisive things about, whether or not Ukraine can continue this war, how this war will continue, is a level of support from NATO, both in terms of financial assistance, ammunition, other kind of weapons, things of that nature. One of the things that's really important right now is that the more this is an attritional conflict, at least in the time being, it benefits Ukraine, right? And so Russia's having some offensives, they're having some, limited success and some limited gains, but they're taking attrition by doing so. And it means, strategically, that's not necessarily a bad thing for Ukraine, because the more attrition Russia takes, the harder it is to sustain this in the long term, right? And it develops some kind of rotation of how they kind of hold the territory they already hold. Well, what's happening now, Ukraine has M777 howitzers. U.S. has been fighting wrap rounds, the long range kind of ammunition for them. They're supposed to be receiving Excalibur, precision guided munitions for those rounds. All that stuff means Ukraine has a much better ability to just kind of do artillery fights. And part of the issue too is that a lot of the Ukrainian positions at Donbass are really well entrenched, really well defended positions. So they can take artillery strikes, and they're not necessarily a lot of them aren't that vulnerable to 152 millimeter artillery rounds, unless you get something heavier or you have some kind of it's well coordinated to maneuver, right? So that you're suppressing and maneuvering on a target, and you can't just kind of sit in a bunker. Well, the flip side is not true. Because Russia has to do offensive, they don't have the same kind of defensive positions. That means they're more vulnerable to indirect fire. And now with Ukraine, they're getting longer range artillery, more accurate artillery. Not to mention, they're getting we've seen evidence of brimstones being used, UK missiles, switchblades, loitering munitions, all those things that are very, very effective. They can be very useful as a force multiplier for like small units to have longer range kind of capabilities to strike it, very, very accurately at different targets. All those things are good for Ukraine, and it means, in my view, over time, at least on the military side, Ukraine is going to be gaining more than Russia relative. And so, the longer this goes on, the longer Ukraine gets more of these systems into service, longer range systems, more accurate systems, they have an advantage. And so, the big emphasis I think for Ukraine right now is basically, what's holding out the Donbass, not having too many losses, even if they lose some terrain. It's not the biggest issue in the world, as long as they can keep attriting Russian forces, and then as long as we don't have any kind of disastrous loss of forces that get surrounded, some of that nature. I think they're strategically in a good position because they can rely on this kind of NATO support. And I really think that the statement from the U.S. and UK, I think it was like 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, I don't remember, about basically how the objective is to let Ukraine win, right? Not just to kind of survive, but to win. That was a really important statement attempt because Ukraine knew they continued to have their whatever equipment losses they had or ammunition losses they had. They could continue to get that backfilled by the U.S., by the UK, and a kind of statement attempt. That meant that they could commit weapons to the fight in the Donbass they might not otherwise, in order to kind of keep that in reserve in case there's an offensive later on. They had to have that kind of weaponry with. So all that's, I think, really important. I think the extent of kind of NATO arms support and their kind of assistance has become much more effective and important than it was before. And you're seeing that from Russian officials because they're increasing their threats, realizing that this is kind of a decisive point of importance, for how well Ukraine can sustain this war for the rest of the time it goes.
Mike, do you have anything you want to add there?
I think that's generally right. The trajectory of the military balance in this war is clearly in Ukraine's favor over time, given these conditions. And I think the situation for Russia is going to worsen as it goes on, as the West increasingly supplies new capabilities and is able to train the Ukrainian military up on them. That said, it's just clear to me that there's not going to be some kind of stalemate in this war, that we're going to be seeing offensives and counteroffensives and territory trading hands, and that Ukraine has very strong counteroffensive options, right? And so for me, the conversation that if the Russian offensive peters out, then we have some kind of stalemate in this conflict was always somewhat wrongheaded. The evidence just isn't there for those kind of assumptions. Big picture, if we look out in this conflict, not weeks or months, but maybe even more towards the end of this year or next year, if you assume that there isn't going to be a sudden dramatic defeat of Russian forces, I'm just putting that out there, this could become a pretty drawn out conflict in terms of attrition and both sides pursuing a strategy of exhaustion, which is the West looking to exhaust Russia economically and to, over time, attrition Russian forces on the battlefield. But Russia also looking to exhaust Ukraine. Ukraine has taken losses that are not insignificant. We often focus on Russia, Aaron, but we almost never talk about what's happening with Ukrainian forces, in part because we don't know and we don't have good numbers on it. But the casualties on the Ukrainian side are also not small, first. And second, Russia holds Ukraine in part under an economic blockade, right? Both at the port of Odessa and also the access to the Dnieper River. And Ukraine is looking at least minus 50% of GDP this year, and the outflow of a substantial percentage of the population. So this situation is, from my point of view, very tragic, and it's likely going to play out at least for some time, with both sides trying to exhaust each other and their respective political will. I think on the whole, the balance of the equation is very much favorable to Ukraine, at least in the current trajectory of this conflict and with the extent of Western support.
Mike, let me stay with you because this has come up a couple of times in the Q&A, sort of indirectly, and because you mentioned it, is if you're looking around, what are the places where the Ukrainians could perhaps, launch a counteroffensive, a place where they could retake territory that's lost, and will they suffer their own problems crossing rivers? Like we've seen that with the Russians. Do they have their own issues as well that they would have to deal with? In this sort of strategy of exhaustion that you were talking about.
Yeah, sure. So the two logical places are around Kharkiv, which has already taken place. You've seen an extended Ukrainian counteroffensive to push Russian artillery away from the city. And that was its primary objective. There's a real sparsity of Russian forces around that area, as we said, because Russia in general has a real shortage of manpower. I also see strong options for Ukraine southwest around Kherson city, where Russian forces are trying to maintain a defensive perimeter around the city, which is on the western side of the Dnieper River. And there they also have a dearth of force and battalion tactical groups. And I think it's possible that over time they could actually be forced to retreat, give up Kherson city, and essentially kind of blow the bridges and try to draw a defensive line on the eastern side of the riverbank and hold on to what parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia they've managed to occupy. You are absolutely right, though. As Ukraine goes on the offensive, ground warfare, the defense is favored, and attrition typically favors the side that's defending tactically. Right? That, of course, all depends on painting with a broad brush here. So, of course, it won't be without exacting a toll. And yes, they too will have to cross rivers, and they too will have to figure out how they deal with Russian defense. And actually, as they go on the offensive, Russian air power might become more effective in those situations than it currently has been, trying to establish local air superiority and trying to provide close air support, which is pretty limited in what they can do in that role. But that being said, Ukraine has substantial manpower, and I think some of that may depend on whether or not they choose to launch offensives now, or if they actually choose to sort of wait and build up to assimilate more Western equipment, put together reserve brigades, and the like. And last point on this is that, at least so far as we've seen it, this has generally been an artillery war. That may not be how it looks like on the internet, all right? And there's a lot of focus on javelins and NLAWs and the like. Those are certainly part of the equation, and they've slowed down Russian forces. But the bulk of the attrition Russia has suffered and the bulk of the damage, the things that really stopped Russian advances, has been Ukrainian artillery, effective use of Ukrainian artillery, and the Russian artillery's general inability to suppress Ukrainian artillery fires. So part of this will really depend on who has the fires and who has the sustainable logistics and ammunition supply. So one of the big, I think, game changers for Ukraine is steadily now getting off of Soviet artillery calibers, which you can only scrounge so much from Europe, okay, from Warsaw Pact countries that have Soviet artillery ammunition left over, and onto US, NATO standard calibers and munitions, where the United States is able then to provide the ammo for sustained artillery fires.
Well, Rob, something I want to come back to you on is on this Manning issue. And I guess it'll be for both of you, is like the news of the day, and I guess it's the news of the week, is like the imminent application of NATO membership for Finland and Sweden, right? And the expected inclusion of those two countries in NATO by the Madrid summit, which I believe is at the end of June. If you look at the overall rates of attrition in the Russian armed forces, how are they well prepared, perhaps, or, thinking about broader conflict with NATO, like with these manpower issues that you guys talked about at the front, and like more broadly, like how that applies to like those frontline states in the Baltics, Poland, and Romania. And beyond that, their own equipment rates of attrition in terms of precision guided munitions that have been used during this fight, and whether or not you guys think that they're dipping into their stockpiles that they have set aside either for contingencies against NATO or for the nuclear role. So maybe I'll go to you first, Rob, and then I'll come back to you, Mike.
Sure. So one thing before we get into it, we touched on this a little before. When you look at the way Russian military is structured, it's well structured for a short, high-intensity conflicts where there's some maneuver, where there's not like a lot of occupation, not a lot of those things, because they have those kind of personnel weaknesses. They don't have the forces for that. But they're well structured to do a lot of damage, right? To inflict a lot of damage, conventional deterrence. They had that capability. And so we talk about some of the kind of NATO, Russia conflicts. Some of the things, the issues we're seeing with Russia and Ukraine is because they're trying to occupy a country that's very difficult to occupy, and occupations are always difficult. And Russia can still do a lot of damage if it is a conventional conflict that didn't involve that kind of goal of occupying cities, occupying a lot of terrain, doing those kind of things. The Russian military is going to be weakened for a number of years, and it's going to take a number of years to reconstitute already what the issues they've had, and it's only going to get worse the longer this conflict goes on. And so, they already have personnel going into it. We already know that at this point. The BDGs, they were talking about 168 BDGs as part of the Russian military. Well, okay, these were formed from battalions that are smaller than we thought. So the actual capability is less than we thought. At this point, they've lost a significant amount of that force. The casualties they've taken have been disproportionately on initially on those permanent readiness BDGs, in particular VDV units, naval infantry, Spetsnaz. All those units have been really heavily hit, and it takes time to reconstitute those kind of numbers. As we said before, personnel is the biggest issue, and it's going to be a huge issue reconstituting quickly because every year, the way Russian military recruits servicemen, they have a draft. A certain number of draftees every year decide to sign contracts. Some stay in a unit, some go to a different unit, but they require a certain percentage of guys every year to sign a contract. Well, currently serving conscripts, I would bet, are going to be less likely to sign a contract right now. The guys currently coming on, who just got were getting drafted right now, Russia deployed a lot of the training officers in the units that are supposed to train these guys, and so a lot of them are not going to be trained that well necessarily. A lot of them, I bet, would not sign contracts too, and there could be a bunch of knock-on effects. The longer this war goes on, the personnel issue is going to be worse and worse. And so it's going to take time to recover from this. It's going to be an issue. We're going to hear more stories about guys who were, sent to war without knowing it. Basically thought it was a training exercise. That day they finally go to war. Guys are not going to necessarily want to, stay in the military on these kind of conditions. There are a lot of leadership issues, a lot of other kind of just, the way this war has been structured. It's something you wouldn't trust yourself serving in a military, wanting to go to war that way because of the way this kind of war was thought about, the political goals, everything about it, right? It was a kind of a blunder for a lot of reasons. All those kind of reasons are going to make it even tougher for Russia to recruit contract servicemen going forward. They already had issues. We already knew they plateaued. They were not reaching the targets they've been trying to reach the last 4 or 5 years. Well, it's only going to get worse at this point. And so we talk about, what could Russia do in the future? Well, first off, as long as this war goes on in Ukraine, the majority of Russia's ground forces are committed to that conflict. They don't have the ability to do much more other than fight in Ukraine and then kind of a holding pattern elsewhere. And so, again, the fact that they deployed battalions from Tajikistan, from Abkhazia, Ossetia, Kaliningrad, all these kind of sensitive areas really shows kind of the problems they're facing. And apparently they're redeploying units from Syria to Ukraine too. Again, just comes back to that issue. So the Russian military, they're going to take a long time to recover the personnel problems they're having right now. When we talk about equipment losses, those are significant too. And it's going to be an open, debate. How well can the Russian OPK replace tank losses, helicopter losses, other aircraft losses? They're not having I think, significant effect on Russia's ability to fight the war right now, but it will have a significant effect of the Russian military's capabilities in the future because so much of that equipment is gone. And a lot of these are some of their best systems. All those things are significant questions. They said about PGMs, Russia's fired more than I thought they'd be able to fire in this war. But a big part of it is they're launching a lot of the long-range munitions, and not necessarily the short-range ones. So Caliber cruise missiles, KH-101s, Iskander M, cruise missiles, tactical ballistic missiles. I don't know how many they have left. It's hard, I think, to predict that. But certainly they've run through a lot of stocks, and it means in a NATO conflict they don't have those kind of numbers available. And we know they're having some accuracy issues, which means you need more of those to kind of be sure you can hit a target. All these things just contribute saying Russia's in a really poor position to fight a conventional conflict anywhere right now. As long as the war in Ukraine is going on, and it doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon, it's going to be a problem. As long as Russia tries to continue to occupy Kherson, Kharkiv, other areas, it's going to be an issue. And even if they stay in the war and somehow can pull those forces back, they're still going to be in a very poor shape to fight a conflict in Finland, anywhere else. And so, they basically the last 10 years or so, they're probably in a weaker state right now. They've been a number of years to fight any kind of conventional conflict, and it's going to be that way for a number of years to reconstitute themselves.
Mike, I know you want to add something there, so go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, sure. So I want to address first a little bit about why I'd end up in a situation that ideas do really matter in the military. And the Russian armed forces, they were conducting period reforms, really kind of assumed that they weren't going to be doing strategic ground defenses, that this was largely a thing of the past in terms of Cold War military doctrine, and that they didn't need either the logistics for sustained ground defenses, because where were you going to be really doing them in Europe if you just even look at the potential outlines of a Russian NATO fight, and beyond logistics, they wouldn't need the manpower either, that there wouldn't be manpower needed to hold substantial amounts of terrain, and they sort of assumed they'd be fighting on a fragmented battlefield, maneuver formations that emphasizes fire, strikes, and enablers, and things like air defense. And so they didn't focus on urban warfare. They didn't build out the manning structure to hold territory and the like. And they assumed the hedge they built into the force was that in the event there would be a large conventional war, that there'd be advance warning, and political leadership would give them time to conduct partial mobilization, raise the manning level for a larger fight. That was kind of the hedge they built in. So both the framework of the war that the political leadership launched in Ukraine totally blew that assumption out of the water, or the fact that it was sort of a secretly organized special operation, but also the fact that they fundamentally assumed that they wouldn't be sent on a war like this, and here they ended up going in, trying to do a number of strategic ground defenses along 3 different fronts, and you can see what a debacle it ended up being. So the other thing I'd like to add to Rob's comments is that, from my point of view, probably where they are right now, equipment is an interesting debate. I think it's a bit less of an issue. I think that the main thing they've lost are tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, but to what extent they can produce additional ones with the resources they have, or pull out relatively comparable ones from storage, is worth discussing. Aircraft and helicopters, they've lost a bunch, but not that much. I mean, they've lost in many categories, maybe 1 year's worth of production. Equipment, they've lost several years of production, but we can debate what the constraints will be on the Russian defense industrial complex moving forward, and how much they'll be affected in replacing these losses. The long-range precision guided munitions, I'm also a bit surprised by. So I suspect that maybe they had bigger stockpiles than we thought going into it. I mean, that's kind of the problem, is that you don't really know what they started with. And so it's hard to predict if they're running low or not. All the folks in the last 2.5 months that have said they're running low, and even I've been guilty of this actually in recent times, looking at some of the munitions they're using, I think have so far been wrong. And they seem to still have a substantial park of cruise missiles. Either that, or they really are digging into their reserve and in capabilities that we might have expected they would hold on for nuclear employment missions. To me, I think the problem they're having is more targeting than actual the missile capability itself and the missile performance. And the last point I'll make is on manpower and force structure. Here, I think the real issue is that. And it's a big question as to what is the Russian political leadership going to do? Are they going to extend the draft, right? Are they going to go from a 1-year draft for conscripts to a longer draft? Are they going to increase the share of conscripts in the force? They might have to, if there aren't enough contract servicemen now signing up to go into this military. Are they going to conduct a partial mobilization? If the Russian economy really tanks, and it clearly is going to go down probably well over 10% of GDP this year, and they offer substantial money in lots of areas in the regions, that money actually could prove quite lucrative to people to sign up for contract service. But it depends. The main, I think, takeaway for me is that I don't think they can go on like this. They'll have to make significant choices. There will be a real dent to the Russian force. There'll be a real dent to the reputation of the Russian military, obviously in the international stage, but also domestically. And that, yes, it's fair to say that the Russian military is going to need quite a few years to recover from this. And that's just saying that now. We don't know if we're near the beginning, middle, or towards the end of this conflict at all. And this could actually get a lot worse for the Russian military.
Well, let me ask you, Mike, and I'll come back to you, Rob. Russia's on the Russia's on the verge of, sorry guys, I'm still dealing with a little bit of a virus, not COVID, but something else. So if they're on the verge of, say, annexing the Kherson, the Kherson region, right, which I think we all agree that they are, or at least they're considering it, how does that impact what these overall broader manpower issues that have been the theme of this entire discussion, right? So if you're going to annex territory, you're going to take it, then presumably you're going to occupy it. You still have forces to do what you need to do in the Donbass. So Mike, I'll start with you, and then I'll come to you, Rob.
So to manage that, they're probably going to bring in as much as they can from Rosgvardia, or actually Russian police and other auxiliaries, and most likely start a recruitment program to see if they can actually hire people within these regions or employ some of the security structures that existed there beforehand. Overall, the Russian military lacks the manpower to hold this terrain. And that's why I was suggesting that if Ukraine successfully launches counterattacks, they will have to retreat and consolidate around something that's more defensible. Right now, their biggest challenge isn't just holding this terrain, it's the fact that behind these forces, there isn't a clearly built out plan for how they will rotate these troops. How will they get these troops eventually off the line, replace these units with other units, and so on and so forth. I think, as Rob accurately stated, what you've basically seen is the entirety of what is available in the active duty force at peacetime strength deploy in this conflict, and a significant percentage of it get attrition such as combat ineffective and get pulled off the line. And so now Russia's fighting with a force that, well, I don't know, this is one analyst's opinion, if I was to throw a dart at the board, this is effectively maybe no more than something like 4 divisions in terms of actual combat strength of what's on there. And that force is, from my point of view, going to be insufficient. Definitely insufficient to hold that territory, especially if there are sustained Ukrainian counteroffensive. And in terms of occupying and holding the terrain, well, the more they actually try to gain in the Donbass, the bigger that challenge will be down the line for them, right? So we're not only, I think, in a place where this looks like the last Russian offensive operation under these constraints, but the more territory they try to gain, the more territory they'll ultimately have to try to defend.
Rob, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the problem for Russia at this point is that there aren't really good prospects for them to inflict more loss on the Ukrainian military than they would sustain these offensives. And if that's the case, whatever terrain they take, the question is strategically, how does it really change Russia's position? And it is politically useful to take some of the parts of Donbass to try and make it cohesive, but ultimately, strategic level, it's not as useful. And if they take losses in doing so, it's not necessarily strategically that useful, and it hurts the kind of sustainability of this operation. In terms of holding Kherson, right, it is certainly a legitimate question of how well they can do that. When the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, it used about like 38% of its maneuver battalions, and like a little over 40% if you count 4th ID, which wasn't used initially. Well, Russia went in with 80% of it, and so the U.S. had National Guard and didn't deploy initially. Those are more military type structure than Russia's National Guard, and of course, Russia invaded with the National Guard as well at the beginning. All of that means, right, the U.S. could develop a kind of sustainable rotation that Russia can't, just based on numbers. And then Russia took heavy casualties. The U.S. did not take in OAF-1 either. All of that just means sustainability-wise, it's a huge issue. And we talk about how Russia should integrate Kherson. It's also a question of, it clearly was not, a lot of this war was not thought out. A lot of it was not pushed down to lower levels to think through how do you do these different operations. How much, planning went into how do we, occupy Kherson? How do we make it part of Russia, or what's the long-term plan? And I don't even up until, end of March, I don't think occupation was the plan. I think Russia was happy to kind of return it if they got their kind of political goals achieved. So it's still a very big question of how do they make this work? How do they make it economically work for those regions? Are they setting the stage for insurgency there, even if the Ukrainian military can't take it? I don't know, but it doesn't seem to me it's a very sustainable solution. And at this point, Ukraine has every incentive to kind of continue this war. because they have legitimate reasons to think they have the upper hands. Things are going their way. Time is on their side. There's a question with the economic aspect, but the other side of it is certainly a question about how sustainable this war is for Russia. And so, as long as that's the case, it's going to be an issue of, can Russia continue to occupy these areas, hold them, and try to end this kind of conflict in a suitable way. There's not a really clear exit strategy, at least in my view, for Russia at this point. I think that's a huge problem for them. And so, not clear where this goes at this point. But as we were saying, the current trajectory of the war, I don't think Russia can continue as it is. They're going to have to make some kind of choices to escalate or de-escalate in some respects. In some ways, it kind of resembles kind of strategic procrastination at this point, where there are a bunch of reports from guys who are Russian correspondents embedded with Russian forces, or some of these kind of Telegram channels run by some Wagner veterans, and not to mention Igor Girkin, guys who have a better understanding of what's happening with Russian forces on the ground in the situation. And they, for a month, a lot of these accounts who are pro-war, they support Russia's position in the war. They've been saying Russia does not have the infantry, they do not have the numerical advantage, and they have to make a change, or otherwise the war is not going to be won. And basically going to continue to kind of continue this war, but they're not going to actually have much more success. Well, it's clear that a change has to happen at some point, but it's not clear what Russia's going to do because of those risks. And I think it's clear. I think we looked at the Victory Day parade. It was noticeable that basically Putin didn't really set the stage for reducing the goals of conflict. I don't think he talked about Mariupol. I don't think he kind of just sell what Russia achieved so far. But he also didn't mobilize. He also didn't say we're going to escalate the conflict. It's kind of just kicking the can down the road. And politically, that might make sense for Putin because they're risky to escalate or de-escalate. But ultimately, it doesn't really give us much of a view of how can Russia make this into a sustainable operation to continue this war. Either there's still huge questions there, and not many good answers about how Russia can do this.
Mike, I know you wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add. So from my point of view, the decisive phase of this war was the first phase and really the first 3 weeks of it. And to be honest, the decisive period of this war was probably the first 4 days, where all the things that constitute Russian political assumptions and concept of operations were completely blown out of the water and went wrong. And to Ralph's point about Russian procrastination, this is really that political leadership modus operandi. And I've seen it before in 14 and post 2015. And the big difference between 2014 and the Russian use of proxies and actually sort of trickling in forces into Ukraine at the opening of this conflict is that even though that period they procrastinated also as the situation got worse and these Girkin types were very much on the verge of defeat by July of 2014, this time around, they do not have the military advantage. They don't have additional forces. They don't have options to suddenly flow additional forces into the battle space with a good chance of defeating the Ukrainian military. So they are procrastinating without options, right? And their procrastination is taking them very much from an initial defeat, which I think is rather deterministic, the first phase of this war, towards what is going to be just a more and more deteriorating situation for the Russian military, and even for political goals that we could consider to be revised down, at least revised down war aims.
So we have about 5 minutes left. So if I could ask like basically a big summary, sum up question is, you both point to these severe challenges and political choices that have to be made on the Russian side. And I think, Mike, you rightly point out, we often talk about Russia because we just don't know as much about the Ukrainian side as we do about the Russian side for a number of reasons. But if the Russians don't just melt away and they dig in and occupy the country, where is this conflict going? And if I could extend this out even to just the Black Sea itself, can they continue to blockade the ports indefinitely? Even if there's some sort of withdrawal, can they continue to try and economically strangle Ukraine itself? And where will this conflict ultimately be headed in this next couple of phases? Maybe I'll go to you, Mike, first, then I'll come back to Rob to wrap it up with the final words.
Sure. So to that point, I'll say despite all the losses and problems the Russian military has had, we've not seen any substantial routes of Russian forces, I think, in this war, or significant surrenders either of entire units. And of course, like, I'll be honest, I could be wrong on that. The fog of war persists, and it takes time to actually find out what happened on the battlefield. So the Russian military has had more staying power than you would expect, given the logistics and the morale issues and all the problems with force availability and actual employment. To your question regarding the long term in this war, the Jews say yes, they can sustain an economic blockade of Ukraine, because this is not a blockade of Ukraine's military or Ukrainian navy. This is a commercial blockade, and they can do it a whole number of ways. They don't need Snake Island to do it. They don't even need a surface combatant force in the Black Sea to do it, because you're not going to find anybody that's going to insure a commercial vessel to go to the port of Odessa. Okay, that's just the reality of it. And Ukraine's going to be challenged to find investors, and Ukraine will be suffering from the outflow of a substantial percentage of the population and of talent. And it is going to be, at least for the foreseeable future right now, obviously you can't predict how a conflict like this is going to evolve, but it will have significant economic effects on Ukraine. At the same time, it is going to be an absolute economic catastrophe from Russia. And many of the true effects of sanctions, I don't believe they're going to see or experience and feel until around August, September time. And then it's going to become a lot more evident to people in Russia what the real consequences of this war are. And it'll be more visible, I think, to us as analysts as well, what the real impact and implications will be of the measures taken thus far. So in this whole conversation of the Western approach to exhaust Russia and the Russian approach too, one thing you have to appreciate is it takes some time to see the real effects and the real impact, and you just can't assess it immediately after the passing of these measures.
Rob, about 2 minutes.
Yeah. So one thing I'm gonna mention that Mike, some of the decisive phase at the beginning. I agree with him, right? And we could say decisive phase might have been the first day or two out of the whole Stonewall operation, first few weeks. One important thing to note is a lot of people are talking that this war is kind of predetermined. That it always end up the way it did. And I don't think that's accurate. And I think if Russia had designed a better operation, if they if Putin had told the soldiers they were going to war, all these other things, it could have turned out differently. One really important thing to note, though, is that up until like mid-March, like March 18, 20th, that time frame, Ukraine and Russia were negotiating. Right? They're negotiating. Ukraine had publicly said they're open to certain public concessions. There was a possibility, and it's hard to say how compliance would have worked for this and other things. There's a possibility Putin could have walked away with this war with some political goals achieved, such as neutrality, some other things, right? Not dead set it would have worked out, right? I think Zelensky said it needed a referendum, other issues there, but there was a possible negotiation to work back then. Once it became clear that Russia could not kind of could not actually advance war in Kyiv, and once they announced the withdrawal, that basically ended, right? Especially once we heard about Bucha, that kind of any negotiation really wasn't going to happen at that point. There was an opportunity early on, and Putin did not go for it, or he didn't empower his negotiators well enough to go for it, and he didn't calibrate military force to achieving political objectives that effectively. All those things, when you look back at the beginning of this conflict, there's an opportunity for Russia to come out of this war with some gains. They didn't do that, and now the prospects look very poor. I think it's one of the really important things to look back is that there going to be a lot of counterfactuals to this war. There were some things that Russia could have done and probably had more success, despite all the failures of this war. They didn't achieve. A lot of that is high-level political decision. But in terms of what was decisive, well, I think they could have achieved some things in the beginning. They didn't, and basically at this point, I don't think Russia can achieve those.
Mike, I know you want to make one point. I'll give you 1 minute, and then we can wrap it up.
I'll just do a quick restrike of the target. So, because you do have a narrative right now, as Rob said, a lot of this was overdetermined. And I tell you, it really wasn't. A lot of this was very contingent on the operation, the way Russia pursued it, the failure of specific efforts, and the failure of Russian political efforts, a whole political ground game that clearly collapsed that we actually know very little about and will come out over time. And we have plenty of folks now that say, oh, we always knew it was going to end up this way. I'm going to tell you that a lot of times in war, the initial takes, especially the hot takes, they're usually wrong, okay? And they're based on very incomplete information It's going to take time to unpack what really happened in the early phase of this war. And I also tell folks, be patient with the field of Russian military analysis. We're still debating what happened in World War I. So 2.5 months into this conflict, we don't have all the answers. And be wary of the people that are out there who tell you they do.
Okay, well, if you want to tune into a debate on World War I, perhaps we can put that together with you, Mike. With that, thank you everybody for joining. Thanks for putting up for my slightly hoarse voice. I appreciate that. And if you want to learn more about FPRI, head on over to fpri.org. And if you are so inclined to support our work, because we are a members-based organization, feel free to flow on over to the right side of our website to the support button and check out all that can come with a membership to FPRI. With that, Mike and Rob, it was a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you everybody for joining me.